Everyone is saying you act like nothing affects you, but they don't hear the wars you fight silently at night. Everyone says you act distant lately, but they don't know how close you came to breaking completely. Everyone is saying you act cold, yet they've never felt how much warmth you had to bury to survive. Everyone says you act unbothered, but they never ask what finally exhausted your heart. Everyone is saying you act different, as if pain doesn't have the right to change someone. Everyone says you act arrogant now, but they weren't there when humility cost you your soul. Everyone is saying you act heartless, unaware that caring too deeply once almost destroyed you. Everyone says you act quiet, not realizing silence became your safest place. Everyone is saying you act strong, not knowing how tired strength has made you feel. Everyone says you act mysterious, but you're just protecting parts of yourself that were mishandled. Everyone is saying you act dramatic, yet they've never felt emotions hit this deep. Everyone says you act guarded because vulnerability taught you painful lessons. Everyone is saying you act detached, when really you're healing in private. Everyone says you act proud, but they never saw you begging the universe for peace. Everyone is saying you act changed, as if growth is something to apologize for. Everyone says you act fake now, not knowing authenticity once cost you everything. Everyone is saying you act distant from love because love once stayed too long and hurt too much. Everyone says you act fearless, but they don't know how fear shaped you. Everyone is saying you act cold-hearted, yet you feel more deeply than most. Everyone says you act self-centered when you finally chose yourself for once. Everyone is saying you act unreadable because they lost access to your inner world. Everyone says you act unapproachable, but only those who hurt you feel locked out. Everyone is saying you act calm, unaware chaos lives just beneath the surface. Everyone says you act independent because dependence once broke you. Everyone is saying you act guarded with your feelings because you learned not everyone deserves them. Everyone says you act healed, but healing is still happening quietly. Everyone is saying you act distant from the past because the past still hurts to remember. Everyone says you act careless, but you're just done explaining yourself. Everyone is saying you act emotionally unavailable because availability once drained you dry. Everyone says you act confident now because insecurity was used against you. Everyone is saying you act like you don't care, but caring too much nearly ruined you. Everyone says you act strange because you outgrew the version they understood. Everyone is saying you act private because public vulnerability burned you before. Everyone says you act calm in storms, not knowing how many storms taught you that. Everyone is saying you act like you've changed for the worse, but you've never been more honest. Everyone says you act protective of your energy because you know how easily it can be stolen. Everyone is saying you act less emotional because emotions were once weaponized against you. Everyone says you act guarded around people because people once failed you. Everyone is saying you act unrecognizable, but this version survived what the old one couldn't. Everyone says you act distant from everyone because closeness once hurt too deeply. Everyone is saying you act fearless, not knowing fear taught you discipline. Everyone says you act cold to love because love once left scars. Everyone is saying you act quiet now because you learned not every thought needs defending. Everyone says you act different in relationships because you finally know your worth. Everyone is saying you act emotionally mature because chaos no longer excites you. Everyone says you act less attached because attachment once cost you peace. Everyone is saying you act hard to read because not everyone deserves clarity. Everyone says you act distant from emotions, but you're just processing them differently now. Everyone is saying you act changed, but they never ask what forced the change. Everyone says you act unbothered because you stopped performing pain for others. Everyone is saying you act calm because panic no longer controls you. Everyone says you act self-aware because denial nearly ruined your life. Everyone is saying you act reserved because openness once invited betrayal. Everyone says you act mysterious because not everyone needs full access to you. Everyone is saying you act detached, but you're deeply connected to yourself now. Everyone says you act emotionally distant because boundaries became necessary. Everyone is saying you act strong because weakness was never protected. Everyone says you act changed overnight, but the change took years of pain.